morning. My name is David Cassak. I'm with the MedTech Strategist. We're a publication that covers the medical device space. And today we're fortunate to have Steve Oesterle and Nicolo Piazza to talk a little bit about what happened yesterday at Innovators Day. Steve Oesterle, as many of you know, trained as a cardiologist and later became senior executive for technology, head of technology at Medtronic, that now sits on several boards for major investors like NEA and Cassak. And Nico is an interventional cardiologist at McGill University in Montreal. Nico, let me start with you. Can you just give us a little sense of what Innovators Day is all about and what the goal of the program is?
Yeah, PCR Innovators Day now is in its 4th edition. And it was meant to be a day where we get physicians, engineers, strategics, all into one room to discuss some evolving issues, some controversial topics in interventional cardiology.
So, Steve, one of the most interesting sessions we had yesterday was a kickoff session on bioresorbable stents. I think that a lot of people thought that bioresorbable stents would be the next evolution from coronary stents to drug-eluting stents to bioresorbable stents. And can you give us some sense of whether you think that that evolution is still the most likely trajectory to take place, or whether, based on what we heard yesterday, particularly with Patrick Sorois's presentation, whether the future of bioresorbable stents is cloudier than that might suggest?
Well, it hasn't taken off the way that many of us thought it would, but I think there's no question that the evolution will continue towards a fully bioresorbable stent for a lot of reasons. Patrick gave a scintillating and incredibly erudite lecture on some of the basic problems that have led to the disillusionment with bioresorbable stents, and really through some really elegant modeling, finite element analysis, flow, dynamic analysis, pointed out some of the basic problems with the absorb stent that led it to have the problems that it has had. I view, and many view, the absorb stent a little bit like the Grunstig DG catheter. It's a first generation device and we've learned from it. The next generation of stents incorporate new materials and, more importantly, new designs and strut size and the way the struts are made that I think is going to allow us to get over some of the issues of late stent thrombosis, which has really held bioresorbable stents back. There's some issues about deliverability also predicated on the kludgy design of the absorbed stent that I think we're going to get over. So Patrick kind of laid out the problems, laid out the solutions, new materials, new designs, and I still believe that within 10 years, 80% of the stents that are deployed in the world will be bioresorbable stents.
So when you think about how technology has evolved over the 20 years, past 20 years in particular, do you think the advantage to develop the truly winning bioresorbable stents rests with the big companies that are currently leading the pack, or do you anticipate that it'll be a small venture-backed startup that will finally develop the right solution in this space?
Yeah, well, look, there's probably 5 or 6 bioresorbable stent companies in evolution. They're all private, small companies. None of the big companies I'm aware of have actually made major innovations in this field, and I'm pretty confident that the next generation of bioresorbable stents will come from a startup that's moving along, and there's probably half a dozen that I think are in the race. 2 or 3 of them are really far ahead.
So Nico, it's not quite the same pattern of evolution, but after tremendous success in aortic valves and then significant progress in mitral valves, we had a session yesterday on tricuspid valves that you led. Can you talk to us a little about where tricuspid valve technology exists today and where you think it's going? How close are we to a kind of final solution or endpoint in tricuspid valves?
The field of tricuspid valve therapy is really somewhat different than the aortic and mitral space. The tricuspid valve regurgitation is something that's very prevalent. It carries a adverse prognosis. It's poorly treated by surgeons, low surgical volumes. The guidelines are very poor with respect to evidence-based medicine. And each time you go in for a surgical tricuspid valve repair or replacement, it's associated with a significant mortality and morbidity. And especially if you have to do a redo, mortalities can go up about 35%. And now we have the opportunity to develop a transcatheter procedure that's percutaneous, that's right-sided, that potentially can be associated with low procedural risk. But the big question is the efficacy of these devices. And there's numerous challenges to be thought about. especially with respect to the fact that the right side of the heart is associated with very fragile tissues and thin ventricular walls.
So a lot of industry and investor interest in both aortic and mitral valve rests with the size of the market. And I think what prompted a lot of interest in mitral is just that some people anticipate it's going to be significantly larger than aortic. Give us a sense of how large the tricuspid valve market could be with this new technology.
Well, if we believe the numbers, apparently only 0.4% of patients with significant tricuspid regurgitation undergo surgical tricuspid valve repair replacement. So there's a definite unmet need in this space.
So Steve, I think one of the interesting things about yesterday's program was it kicked off from the notion that we're 40 years into the interventional cardiology revolution, and interventional cardiology is perhaps the best example of a truly technology-driven advance in medicine. Your keynote speech, however, laid out a very different vision of where technology will ultimately go. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit to us about this evolution that you laid out from hardware to software, a medical technology industry that in the future will be all about advanced analytics and big data.
So again, coronary interventions is a small piece of the picture of healthcare in the world, and I talked more globally about how healthcare is going to change, not necessarily interventional cardiology. But when you think about it, David, the biggest disruption that's occurring in the world is around software. You look at things like Uber that has totally disrupted the transportation industry with no cars, it's all software. Airbnb totally disrupts the housing market, no properties, it's all software distributed. Bitcoin probably will make bank vaults obsolete, it's all software. And probably the last place that has resisted change in this direction is medicine for lots of reasons. But it will happen, and you see this being played out across the board. And probably the best example of that is the ascendancy of Verily, which is the Google healthcare arm. In the last 2 years, they've taken an extraordinary amount of investment from companies like GSK to make a neuromodulation company, J&J to work on a robot company, Verb, Sanofi Pharmaceuticals to basically manage the world's type 2 diabetics. You might be asking, what are all these companies doing going to Google? And what they're doing is basically seeking out someone who espouses without any ambiguity to be the world's aggregator of all data and to get information from it. This is so-called machine learning, artificial intelligence. I like to call it cognitive computing, but what it is basically taking large data sets and learning from it and making predictive decisions based on it. If you have good data and a lot of data, I think there's a little question that computers will be better than physicians at making some clinical decisions. This will play out in clinical trials, in monitoring clinical trials, and I happen to believe that within a decade, the largest healthcare company in the world will be Verily, Google Health, because data is such an important factor in everything that we do. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that Google's going to disrupt interventional cardiology, but you can imagine a day where we could predict who's at risk for developing coronary disease and intervene so that they never develop plaque rupture, never have acute coronary syndrome. And then this will impact my friends in Montreal and other places, but that's a long way away. In the short run, you're going to see how Google's going to aggregate data for surgical robots, for managing diabetes, heart failure, various things, which is 85% of the healthcare spend is spent on chronic diseases, not on coronary intervention. So this is going to be a huge disruption in the healthcare market. People better get ready for it.
So Nico, you introduced us to the concept of innovation overload yesterday, and I wonder, as you listen to Steve talk about the role that big data is going to play, I wonder if you could just explain to us briefly what innovation overload is and how you could envision incorporating big data into whether clinical trials practice or even into your own individual practice.
Sure. The idea really came from one of our brainstorming sessions, in fact, and it came from the mitral space. And as a physician, thinking that we have so many devices out there available to us to use, as a physician, we sorry for the cliche, but we felt overloaded with the amount of devices that were being presented to us, and which device should we use for our patients. But this concept can also be translated to the strategic, with a number of available devices, where should he or she invest in? With respect to IP, once you have tons of devices out there, there must be tons of IP involvement, and how do you sort that out? And at the end of the day, really, is it affecting the progress being made with these devices? For example, within the transcatheter mitral valve replacement field, there's been about maybe 150 replacements up to date. There's probably about 10 to 15 centers in the world who perform these procedures, and there's about 10 devices out there that have been implanted in humans. That means on average that each center is implanting about 10 devices, and this has been going on now since 2012, so we're at the 5-year stretch. So really we're implanting about 30 devices per year, and the question is, how do we, how do physicians sort of get around the procedural techniques? How do the engineers improve on their devices if there's so many devices out there, and we're not concentrating really on a particular one or two particular devices? And this is completely different than what it was in the aortic field.
Procedural technique and device enhancements are an important part of the clinical trials process, but the sheer burden of clinical trials is, I know, an issue for a lot of small companies and their investors. Can you envision a world in which data and machine learning helps to streamline the process, or at least make it less burdensome, so we can bring these products to market or have them fail quicker?
Yeah, I was intrigued by Steve's talk yesterday about collecting big data and the ability of artificial intelligence to perhaps replace physicians. And maybe these big data are going to inform us on also trial design and help us randomize patients. We had a discussion yesterday evening at dinner, and someone was telling me that within the oncology space, because there are so many trials going on, that there is now computer-based learning programs that are able to decide, once you put in a patient's particular demographics, in which trial they'd be best suited for. And perhaps physicians don't have that sort of memory in them. But this is one example of how computers may help us within trial designs and randomizing patients, and at the end of the day, collecting data to make clinical decision making.
Well, I want to thank you both for staying. This has been a short discussion, but only begins to capture how interesting the discussions were yesterday. Steve, great keynote presentation, which I think left a lot of people thinking very broadly about where medical technology is going, and many of the interim sessions talked about specific technologies and where they're evolving in the next couple of years. So thank you both very much, and have a good PCR.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.